welcome to Acid Horizon. Today, we are so happy to be joined by Kenny Novis, some of whom you may know from recently being interviewed by Craig, who's usually here, who's the host of Left Hand, who recently did an episode on Simone Weil, Platonism, the mystic tradition, among many other things. And today, Kenny Novis was joining us to interview David Levy, who is the translator and one of the translators and editors of the recent Simone Weil Basic Writings. David is a philosophy professor at the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences at Edinburgh. And he works primarily on Simone Weil, but also moral philosophy, Platonism, and other comparable moral trajectories. Simone Weil obviously being the notable political activist and French mystic who has frankly inspired everyone from Giorgio Agamben to Pope Paul VI to even some of Deleuze's students. So if you've followed any of the various thinkers that Acid Horizon has engaged with, you have come across in one way or another a concept like decreation or certain things that are found in the need for roots, or even if you're a fan of, say, Susan Sontag, you've definitely come across some of the kinds of analysis found in the Iliad or the poem of Force. So thank you two for joining us. And I will just hand it over to Kenny Novis with the question, who is Simone Weil?
So Simone Weil obviously was born 1909 into kind of a middle-class Parisian family. She is a fascinating figure in the history of French philosophy, in part, as you said, because of the extraordinary range of connections that she established during her relatively short career. So I know that while she was in Paris, one person with whom she was acquainted was the Marxist philosopher Henri Lefebvre, but perhaps more significantly in her own time was her contentious relationship to Simone de Beauvoir, a very popular story which is recounted in de Beauvoir's autobiography. Has it that while the two of them were preparing for the entrance examination to the ENS, de Beauvoir had heard about Simone Weil. She describes her as having this heart that could beat across the world, so this is also offering some context to Simone Weil's well-documented anti-colonialism. De Beauvoir approached her and said to Weil something like, I believe that what we should be doing is questioning the meaning of people's existence. And then Weil, she says, looks her up and down and says, I can see that you've never gone hungry. Now, this story could be entirely apocryphal. It's possible that de Beauvoir made it up, but nonetheless, I think it's illustrative of what so many people find extraordinarily compelling about Simone Weil. Since we have David with us, and since we're talking about the basic writings, I might start us off with something that I think is particularly impressive about this. Yes, it's called the basic writings, but there's also a temptation one might have to call it the essential writings. I think because there's very little in here, or there's very little that's missing from the anthology that one would need to consult to actually get a really good grasp on Simone Weil. There are some small things, like her famous essay on the Iliad, and possibly also her essay, God and Plato. But really, the core things that people look at when they're talking about Simone Weil, like God's Love and Affliction, the essay, and implicit forms of the love of God. It's all here, all retranslated. And looking through some of the changes in the translation, it really surprises me how significant some of these changes are, but perhaps that's something we can get David to talk about. I'm sure I had something else I wanted to mention, but perhaps it will come up over the course of the conversation. To start us off then, David, if it's all right, maybe we could just get you to say something about your own research and how you came across Simone Weil in the first place.
Well, I was a doctoral student, and my supervisor, Ray Gaeta, one day he handed me the essay, which is known as Human Personality, which arguably is her best single piece of work. And he said, "You might like to read this." And that's all they said, really. And off I went and read it. And I can't say that I took to it straight away. Straight away, I realized I was dealing with an unusual person and that there was an uncommon moral seriousness to the way that she wrote and to the ideas that she focused on. And her approach was particularly striking because it moved so quickly from the immediate and the human to the tremendously metaphysical, with a lot of political stuff in between. And that was also unusual. Clearly, it wasn't written like academic philosophy either, although it had a very clear structure. I mean, it was a very good essay and very well written. And it was Richard Rees's translation, which is quite soaring. And so the language was also pretty impressive. So yeah, that's was my first introduction. I had a bit of an allergic reaction to some of the religious language in it. And I wondered to what extent, how much work that was doing, whether her philosophical ideas needed the religion. And at that time, my first thought was, I wonder to what extent those of us who may be more secular can make use of these religious concepts. To what extent are these religious concepts part of our intellectual, philosophical inheritance? And to what extent can they survive and be effective if you don't believe? So initially, it was a striking encounter. That was like 25 years ago, so it was quite a while ago. And then I have to say I've been reading her ever since and trying to understand her ever since. A few years ago, I was possibly foolhardy enough to think that I might be ready to teach a course on Weil. So I started teaching an upper level undergraduate course on Weil, and that helped a lot. You never realize how much you don't understand until you try teaching it. So that was certainly helpful. But I guess what I would say now is you then don't realize how much you didn't understand until you try translating it. So I suppose I've been through all the levels now. And for a while there, while I was translating her, I felt like I was getting a lot closer to a kind of symbiosis with her mind. I really felt like I knew how she thought, and her mind was a very familiar and comfortable place to me. But yeah, that's how I got started with her. And in terms of ongoing research, well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of Weil. Getting some good translations that are philosophically informed and consistent, I thought might be a step towards trying to unpick some of those misunderstandings. In some cases, they're mere misunderstandings of emphasis, but in many other cases, I think people just simply misunderstand what she says. And I suppose that's what I would like to do, building on top of the translations, is now say, okay, let's go through some of her positions. Let's state them clearly so that we can say, this other view seems to be a misunderstanding or one that's disputable. But also, once we've actually articulated her views clearly, then they can be subjected to some criticism as well, some tough criticism. Too much of the commentary on Weil is kind of hagiographic, and it's almost as if they merely want to cite her as a kind of authority, as opposed to a thinker with thoughts that are developing, for which she often gives very significant considerations in their favor, as well as revealing a kind of outlook on philosophy itself. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, would you like to go ahead, Will?
No, I mean, I was wondering if maybe you could talk about Simone Weil's philosophical education, and perhaps help us gain an insight into where one of the things that struck me the most, because again, like so many figures who tragically passed in the period that she did, they're treated with a kind of hagiographic tone. And I don't, in the political sense, I understand and respect this. And at the same time, you're right, it precludes a kind of, I hate this word, but authentic engagement with them that is worthy of their work. And I'm wondering if maybe we can start with, she takes the entrance exam and the aggregation and all of those other expectations from the ENS at that time. And her area of focus is like so many from her period, other than Simone de Beauvoir, right, who truly is of the Germanic tradition. She's a Hegelian, really. She's closer, frankly, to the kind of education of Camus, who's very different, right? But she's a classicist in this sense. And I'm wondering, the entrance of theology into her thought and her specialization in ancient philosophy. Can you talk about, maybe in a way that someone like me, who truly is a neophyte to this thinker, who understands her only through reference and through these essays, how this relationship to Plato developed in Weil, and maybe where it's overemphasized or underemphasized?
And the first thing to understand is that she had a superb philosophical education. I mean, she had about as good a philosophical education as you could hope to get in France without doing a doctorate. And a doctorate wasn't the sort of thing necessarily that French academics would have been doing at that time. Remember that they were a kind of German invention, sort of an import, and that neither the British nor the French had particularly adopted them by the time she was going through her education. She went to the best school, which was the École Normale in Paris. And before that, she went to this high school, which was also probably the best high school in France. But crucially, she had this teacher there, Alain. And although he was nominally a high school teacher, he was a very well-known essayist whose notoriety would have been on par to the kind of notoriety that Bertrand Russell enjoyed as a public intellectual when he was at the height of his powers. So she had been studying philosophy, as the French do, for quite a while. On top of that, it's important to remember that she had learned Greek and Latin quite young. So certainly by what we would think of as middle school, she would have been reading Greek and Latin well. And so we know that she was making jokes with her brother as a young child about bits of Greek poetry or Greek literature. So that's important for establishing the fact that she early on had the kind of fluency that allowed her to engage with Plato and other Greeks directly. Secondly, her philosophical education spanned the classics, we might say. So she was certainly familiar with early modern philosophy, and you can see in her discussions that she's obviously been acquainted also with some of the high points of medieval philosophy as well. That doesn't mean that she knew every philosopher, but she certainly knew plenty of them in depth, and not just those that were on the continent. For example, you can tell she's been strongly influenced by Hobbes at various points. Maybe influenced in a negative sense, namely responding to Hobbes, but nonetheless is aware of that. So she's absolutely steeped in what you might call academic philosophy and gets a very thorough education in that regard. Now, with regard to Plato, some of that comes to her through Alain. And we know from her high school essays that many of those are already showing the influence of Plato on her thinking. That being said, we have to square that with the fact that the dissertation that she wrote for her university degree was not on Plato. It was basically on Descartes. And I'd say the person who gets the second biggest look in after Descartes in that dissertation is probably Spinoza. So although Plato gets mentioned, but really at that time you can see she is thinking in terms of modern philosophy. It's also important, I think, and interesting that in that dissertation, she doesn't work with the best known works of Descartes. She works with the works that are far closer to his thinking as a scientist. So in working with Le Monde, for example, she is far closer to the kind of problems where science and philosophy intersect about, for example, basic perception, the possibilities of movement, of directed movement, of making use of the natural world to achieve our ends. So philosophically, I better try and say something by way of summary. Philosophically, she was extremely well grounded in philosophy. Plato was always there, both from her own personal interests, then through Elam, and then obviously she was still interested in Plato when she was at the ENS. But there, of course, she would have had to engage with the curriculum as it was set by her tutors and teachers at the ENS. It comes back in a big way, I suggest, when she makes this turn in her thinking around 1937, and she moves away from a much more voluntaristic picture of human beings to one in which human beings are confronting the reality that they are subjects of necessity. And at that point, she suddenly sees that the Plato, which has been her love and often has shaped her thinking, but I think she now sees that there's an opportunity to elaborate on Plato in ways that increasingly inform her philosophy.
Yeah, that's a really cogent summary of her life and her influences. Let's, if it's all right, get a bit into the anthology itself. So, David, I've known you for, I think, 3 years now, something like that.
All right, yeah.
And one of the things I remember standing out to me from your period of instruction is your emphasis on Weil's essay concerning the Pythagorean doctrine. And one of the first things you pointed out to me when I started working on my master's dissertation on her was that this is a strangely overlooked but extremely insightful essay when it comes to understanding her philosophy. And you and Marina have retranslated this, as well as some of the associated writings with it, for the anthology. So what, in your eyes, is the significance of the essay concerning the Pythagorean doctrine, as well as that of the shorter pieces related to it that you've translated?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and it's an opportunity to talk about, as you say, an essay that I think is one of the keys to understanding Weil's philosophical thinking more clearly. Some people have noticed that it's important. So Miklos Veto, in his really very good book in many ways, although I think he's mistaken, but nonetheless, his good book on the religious metaphysics of Simone Weil, he says this is a very important essay. But then he doesn't actually make that much use of it in his book, which is interesting. Now, let me just say briefly, there's essentially three pieces. There's the essay itself, and then there is a kind of a start on the essay that she began, which hadn't been translated before, and so we've translated that for the first time. And then outside of that collection, Basic Writings, I've also translated something that she wrote after she wrote the essay. So we have the thing that she wrote beforehand, and we have the thing that she wrote afterwards. And what she wrote afterwards was her own summary of that essay. Now, that in itself is notable because it means she was actually interested in what she had written and felt that it was something that she needed to create an aid memoir about, because she might have wanted to use it later, or perhaps because she thought she had expressed herself in ways that were different. That summary was in her notebooks, and Marina and I recently translated that and published it online through the great Simone Weil online site Attention. Now, so now we can focus on the main essay. So here are a couple of interesting things I think about this essay. The essay is absolutely contemporaneous with some of her most important essays and big essays, God's Love and Affliction and Forms of the Implicit Love of God, which are also two of her most essays in which she's really dealing with theological topics. You know, one of them is to do with theodicy, and another is to do with what kind of relationship can we have with God here in our material existence. So it's absolutely contemporary with those two well-known essays that are well understood to contain some of the deep keys to her philosophy. However, despite being contemporaneous, when I mean contemporaneous, I mean within like a month or two, the starting point for these essays are quite different. And in some ways, the audience is quite different. So both God's Love and Affliction and Forms of the Implicit Love of God were written for Father Perrin, this friend and mentor that she had made when she was in Marseille. And to some extent, she writes to him knowing what his interests are and wanting, I think, to speak to him in themes and terms that he could directly relate to as a Dominican. He then asks, he says, look, I've been put in charge of educating young priests. Can you give me some ideas of how you would teach Plato in connection with training these young priests? So suddenly we have a change in the kind of writing. First of all, she's now to some extent teaching him, or at least suggesting to him what he ought to teach. Secondly, she's back in her role as a teacher, which of course was the only really steady work she'd ever had, which was working as a teacher teaching philosophy in high schools for those students who were hoping to get into the École Normale. So the starting point for these essays, for this essay, despite being contemporaneous, is different. And I think that in itself is quite interesting. She suddenly has a didactic responsibility that she didn't have before in something like God's Love and Affliction or Forms of the Implicit Love of God. So I think that makes it interesting because it pulls from the exact same soil those notebooks that she wrote between 1940 and 42 when she was in Marseille, as well as the ferment caused by her meeting in the last year that she was in Marseille, Father Perrin, and becoming involved with it. So it draws from the same roots, but it looks like a rather different essay. One reason it's different is that, like a lot of the material that she wrote, but which has not very much been published, is there's quite a bit of exegesis. So the early part of the essay, she says, look, you need to look at these Greek texts and these Greek texts and these Greek texts, and they're mostly either pre-Socratic Pythagorean type texts, or they are Platonic texts. So you need to look at these Greek texts and we need to study them. And she's going to extract something from that essay and then say, notice that there is a similarity between these Platonic pre-Socratic Pythagorean ideas and these ideas that I have identified in the New Testament, in Christ's teachings. So she's quite explicit there in setting out the opportunity for there to be a parallel by pulling them out separately in this didactic and exegetical way. So again, I think that's quite interesting because she's sort of been given an opportunity to teach there. The other thing is that she says more about mediation in this essay than anywhere else, even more so than in the notebooks. And one of the reasons when we were choosing chapters for the basic writings, we really wanted to focus on essays, was that she was trained to write essays. And when she wrote essays, she often took her rough writings from the notebooks, which had been written for herself, and subjected them to the kind of rigor required for constructing a well-structured essay. So what I think we have here in this essay on the Pythagoreans is a thought-through version of much of what we find in the notebooks. I think the same thing is true of the Forms of the Implicit Love of God and also God's Love and Affliction. And again, that's why I really like those essays more than going to the notebooks, which I think are less well-formed. Now, still there's a question about why did I tell you, for example, this is the one you need to read? I think it's because it is the essay in which she's most explicit about her metaphysics. And not just the metaphysics of the supernatural, which here just means that which goes beyond the merely material. So it's not just that she talks about metaphysics in that sense, but she really focuses on the interface between the natural world and the supernatural world. And to some extent, that's really talking about the interface between the mind and the world and the structures or necessities that make possible that connection between the mind and the world. And so, again, it's notable that right towards the end of the essay, she starts to bring up Kantian themes. And she mentions Lagneau, for example, and uses these examples from the French thinker who is indirectly influenced by Kant through Maine de Biran. And she's back to talking about the psychology, even the science of perception, after she's just taken us through this long journey from the Greeks through Christianity, and then she winds up in this place. So in this essay, I think we get something like the full compass of her philosophical interests. We have the role of science, we have the role of Plato, and we have, of course, all of the benefits that we get from the tradition of Christianity, this Western tradition which we have inherited, which is a collection of concepts, a collection of language, a collection of explanations, which she thinks are very, very useful. On the other hand, she also says in that essay at various points, when we think of God this way, which of course is necessarily false because we can't really imagine what God is like, I think it's again revealing that she thinks, I don't think it would be right to say that she thinks this is a useful fiction. I don't think that's what she thinks at all. She thinks, following Plato, that there are some things which cannot be grasped given our material conditions, our temporal conditions, our cognitive limitations. So we are obliged to grasp them indirectly by what we can call a process of mediation. And that process of mediation can go by way of different collections of thoughts, concepts, patterns of thinking and explanation, of which the received Christian tradition is one, the Platonic Pythagorean tradition is another. And as she says, look, if we can't revivify the Christian tradition, we'll have to fall back on the only other thing which is native to us Westerners, which is the language of science. So crucially, she thinks in some sense, the truths about the world, supernaturally speaking, are accessible through any of these three routes. That, in terms of bodies of doctrine, that might get us there. There are other routes to personal contact with reality, but with regard to thinking our way towards that which is cognitively inaccessible and conceptually problematic to represent, she says, look, there's lots of different ways. And so I think that conspectus, that breadth of vision in that essay is what makes it such a powerful essay as the prism for splitting out and separating strands of the Weylian philosophy. As you know, I'm incapable of giving a short answer, apparently.
No, I think that's perfect. And this question of doctrine allows us to sort of delve into one of the threads of these essential writings or basic writings, which really is all of these sort of notions that are floating around both Weil's engagement, or let's say intentional disengagement. I don't like that. Her disengagement with politics, which is nonetheless an engagement. All of it surrounds her understanding of liturgy and the let's just, like, we could very vaguely say, like, the soteriological, the salvationary, but really mostly this question of doctrine within the history of religiosity, within the history of liturgy, and of course the seventh essay being, is there a Marxist doctrine? But rather than diving into her engagement with Marx, which is both a fascinating sort of intellectual biographical piece, which I think sometimes in some ways sort of counters the general trend that, Marx's whole education was just him placing, Kantian and Hegelian masks on different figures in the history of philosophy for the entertainment of Bruno Bauer. She takes Marx at his word in his Aristotelianism, which I think is kind of rare. But that aside, this notion of doctrine seems to be something that sort of follows Weil throughout these pieces. And I'm wondering if, even though it's not an operative term necessarily, in the way that, say, decreation or beauty or affliction might be. I'm wondering if you can illuminate for us what doctrine means for Weil and why it's so important, and perhaps this can help us understand this sort of science religion decatonic structure.
Yeah, I mean, I may have used the word doctrine and placed more emphasis on it than it really deserves. What I meant to say really is that I think Weil has a definite philosophy. She's certainly not a purveyor of lots of aphorisms. And I don't think that her philosophical projects are particularly disconnected from each other. One of the reasons I like the Pythagorean essay is that it makes her work look more systemic, or at least more comprehensive. On the other hand, when you asked me about my first encounter with her, I think the thing that still holds true for me is that she has a remarkable ability to move from the individual in their direct contact with reality, in their confrontation with their own limitations, all the way up back to the metaphysical. So the fact that she's able to move back and forth, I think, is, first of all, to be seen in the essay we were just describing, as well as the essay that we translate closer to the original title as Is the Human Person Sacred? So as regards doctrine, I mean, I think she thinks that there are definite things to be said. For example, she really can give you a definition of what she thinks natural justice is. And politics can only achieve natural justice. But she does think that politics can achieve natural justice. And insofar as politics can achieve natural justice, it bloody well should try to do so. And it should be structured so as to realize that aim. However, what she thinks is that politics itself cannot deliver supernatural justice, because nobody can, as it were, be made to be good in the sense that supernatural justice would require. But what the political structure can do is remove those contaminants, those obstacles to the natural realization of the potential for goodness that she imagines, I think correctly, are latent in every single human being. So one could speak of a Walian doctrine on various topics, and in particular politics. There, I think it's more of a doctrine of being clear about the scope for the collective. I don't mean the noun in this sense, I mean the adjective, that which is collective, and also for the political. I think she wants to bound those quite clearly. And that's why she put such an emphasis on those things which are, in a sense, undertaken individually, like work, but where the character of that work is very much shaped by what has been done communally, collectively. So that, as it were, the work itself, of course, is necessarily undertaken by the power, by the hands, by the body of the individual. But the possibilities for what that work can mean, for the ways in which that work can be nurturing or not, the extent to which that which is negative about work can be mitigated, those are all problems which the political can do a great deal to alleviate by limiting the power of others to oppress, for a start, but more generally by creating an environment in which people can develop the kinds of aptitudes and abilities and understanding that will make work more rewarding for them. I don't know whether I've quite answered your question on doctrine. I've taken a swing at it. I wouldn't like to emphasize doctrine unless I've missed some aspect.
No, I think that helps us understand specifically where she's writing, particularly about the relationship between, for example, Marx's account of history, war, and class struggle, where this notion, this new concept of not praxis, but more importantly, that schism that's introduced between philosophy and praxis, that's further emphasized by thinkers, say like Lukács or Karl Korsch or so on. Like with essays like this, we start to see that in fact, these sorts of issues within materialism as such were already starting to arise, even as thinkers like Proudhon or other interlocutors with Marx were writing. And it shows a kind of attention to modernity that sometimes is set aside for Weil, and instead we think of thinkers like Sartre or the Frankfurt School, who are readers of Karl Korsch and so on, and these other thinkers we place on the side of an idealist Platonism who have no account of history. But no, I think it speaks to a kind of attentiveness to the modern philosophical project that I think can help us understand why political philosophers of the 20th century were so deeply invested in Weil. Thinkers like, for me, because I work on biopolitics, mostly Michel Foucault, thinkers like Agamben, who you would think would have very little other than theologically to do with Weil, actually have quite a theoretical and methodological indebtedness to them. So I think that's a great answer, but I'll hand it back over to the expert here, Kenny.
Well, in fact, as David was talking, something that did occur to me is that she might have another kind of concept of doctrine that's working away in the background here. Just by way of context, I do a lot of work on Spinoza as well. And there's a word he uses in Latin that there's a bit of a disagreement on how to translate. It's the Latin dogmata. Some translators, like Jonathan Israel, I believe, translate it as doctrine, others translate it as dogma. So perhaps, in a sense here, in asking about what Weil has to do with the idea of a doctrine, we can also think about what she has to say about the Catholic dogmas. And what she has to say about them is that they are these sorts of things. One might say that they are metaxu, things by contact with which we can enter into some kind of correspondence with the supernatural, the realm of the true, the realm of the good.
That's precisely what's happening here, right? There's that extremely polemic, like a Marxist would be flared up, partially because just how dogmatic they are, but would flare up in anaphylaxis if they read the paragraph that says Marx had no interest in being scientific. This materialist is only interested in justice. He was obsessed by it, right? On the one hand, this would be deeply insulting to like an Adornonian or something like that, but on the other, the entire history of Marxist philosophical and political practice would say, oh, well, yes, it makes perfect sense, coming from his account of Aristotelian virtue and the fact that Marx could not escape Rousseauian republican tendencies. So at the same time, there, through her kind of she perhaps one thing I could say speculatively, because I'm the neophyte here, is that through her supposed engagement with a very particular kind of idealist tendency in Platonic thought. And what's interesting too is like Aquinas doesn't feature as much as I thought he would. Through this, she gets to engage in a different kind of materialist analysis, one that's not entirely dissociable from thinkers that would come later, like Rainer Sherman or Foucault, who have not a history of ideas, but rather a kind of discursive formation understanding of philosophy. Bachelard being another one. So there is this kind of deeper materialism that's cutting beneath the dogmatic, in the derogatory sense of the dogmatic sense of particularly a very French kind of socialism that I think is still pretty pervasive in Marxist academia today. Or if we look at like the state of like publishing lines like historical materialism and so on, and the kinds of things that they focus on. But yeah.
I think it's interesting you mention dogmas, Kenny, because you're right. Certainly she did concern herself with dogmas. And I think dogmas provide an interesting way to think about why she was really unable to become, in some sense, a proper Christian. You get some idea of this in her long letter, so-called letter to a priest, in which she points out certain dogmas, certain Catholic dogmas, which she just won't accept, partially because I think she thinks they're morally problematic. But actually, I think this reveals something else, which I think is slightly interesting about her. Her brother speculated, so I really borrow this idea from her, but I've reflected on it myself, and I think he's right. Ultimately, she really believes in the freedom of the intelligence and the responsibility that we have to operate the intelligence. And it's well known that her favorite book by Descartes was Rules for the Direction of the Intelligence. And it's a pretty straightforward book in many respects. It really does say, here's the first rule. Now let me explain why that's the rule. But these are these rules. It's incomplete, but nonetheless, there's plenty of rules there. And I think that she thinks that we have a kind of responsibility by means of the intelligence to know what can be known and to be honest with ourselves through our intelligence. And that one of the challenges that she faced would have been submitting herself to the authority of the church and to, in that sense, shackling her own intelligence. And so I think the dogmas that she's kicking against in Letter to a Priest are really just particular instances of the more general dynamic, which is that she was unwilling to submit her intelligence to external control. Now, that's interesting, I want to suggest, for a further reason, which is, on the other hand, in her philosophy, she is always very clear. There are only some things that can be known by the intelligence, and there are things that cannot be known by the intelligence. And in many ways, the most important things can't be known by the intelligence. They can't be put into a discursive form. In this respect, they can't be, as it were, taught or inculcated directly. And these things of the highest importance, as I say, can't be grasped by the intelligence. They're going to require things like attention, desire, love. All of these will allow us to get into the right relation to these things which can't be understood by the intelligence, so they then become an influence on us. And so it's interesting you mentioned dogmata. Of course, dogmata is Latin taking up the Greek directly. So, of course, dogmata is also there in Greek. And famously, it's said, though, of course, as will become clear, nobody knows if it's right, that the most important doctrines that Plato taught his pupils were the unwritten doctrines, the so-called agrapha dogmata, and that they had to be unwritten, actually. And in some sense, the dialogue form itself is an attempt to get around the limitations of what can't be written down in the mode of philosophy, let's say. Something that Aristotle just didn't worry about. But as it were, these things could be said. You could hope to communicate with somebody. You could hope to bring them into relation with these things. But they had to remain agrapha, that is to say, unwritten. So that idea of dogma and dogmata is a very nice pivot point around which one could shine a light on a lot of Weil's life, commitments, method, and indeed thinking.
Well, as I see, we're now verging on the realm of Weil's relation to the esoteric, if I can put it that way. It may be worthwhile picking up on one of the controversies that this anthology has already, in fact, generated. It's especially the long introduction that you wrote for it, and if I can say for any listeners, if you want a good 40, 50 or so pages to look through and find yourself in possession of a strong interpretation of Weil, you could certainly do much worse than starting with this introduction in the anthology. But in that, you make this claim that Weil is too readily categorized as a Christian mystic. And this is something that Eric O. Springstead, another major Weil scholar and translator, has taken particular exception to. In other places, I've defended also something like the view that she wasn't a mystic, or at least she wasn't a mystic in an ordinary sense of that term. But it would be interesting to hear from you what reasons you have for thinking this, and what significance there might be for challenging this standard association of her philosophy with mysticism.
Yeah, great. It's a great question. I don't like to think of it as a big controversy, although I agree that people disagree. And I thought that what Eric was saying was, pretty reasonable. A lot of it's going to come down to what you think the word mystic means or connotes. The reason I was so keen in my introduction, an introduction that I was aiming at the sort of intelligent layperson to some extent, was to push back against the so frequent assimilation of Weil to this category of the mystic. And to somebody who is such a disciplined thinker as she is, I feel that this word mystic in the mouths of most people is a kind of solvent of that discipline, it kind of is in tension with it. And I don't think that's right. I mean, it may be okay to call her a mystic, provided that doesn't undermine those aspects of her thought which I think are evident in her writings: the diligence, the brilliance, the structure, the care, the concern with a kind of consistency across different parts of her thinking. At that level, by the way, I'm rather doubtful that Eric and I really disagree about the main question, because I think the point he would wish to make, and he is of course right to make it, is that, if I put it this way, Christian mysticism is a broad church, and it has a very wide range of people who get put underneath this rubric. And many of them, he would be quick to point out, spend a lot of time thinking, and they spend a lot of time writing, and they spend a lot of time reasoning. So often, for example, they have had some kind of mystical experience, but they then don't mine it indefinitely as if somehow it were a subspace communication channel to God that they could kind of keep on trying to tune in with a cosmic radio. They have had this experience. That experience has given them a certain kind of conviction. And on the basis of that conviction, they have then been able to use that as a ground for further careful thinking about the kinds of mysteries which are inherent in human life as thinking, conscious, experiencing beings. So I think if we were to use a meaning of mystic that is far closer to the specialized way in which theologians use the term, historians of mysticism use the term, in other words, people who are using the term with some precision, then I think it would come down to a matter of detail. And of course, what I would want to emphasize, the reason I would want to say that Weil is not a mystic in the ordinary parlance, is that she gives arguments. Although she writes in a very assertoric way, that is to say, she asserts this and she asserts that and she asserts this other thing. And her essays are often very gripping because of what she asserts at the outset, although I think those assertions are often there for clarity. She will make these assertions, but then she will give arguments. You've got to learn how to read them. And I think that, if I may say so, I think that our translations make it easier to see the arguments and to see that she's giving arguments. But that nonetheless, she may start with some bold claims, and then she will work her way down. So in addition to giving arguments, she often also says, this can be confirmed or verified experimentally or experientially or empirically. There's a kind of question about how to translate the French word in question. But essentially, she means by demonstration. So it would not require you to enter into a mystic state. It would not require you, for example, to have faith. Many of the claims that are doing the work for her in her philosophy, she ultimately wants to say, look, it's demonstrable. In the same way that somebody might have thought, nobody can be struck a blow and not want to strike back. And then somebody points to Jesus and says, look, here's a guy turning the other cheek. What was impossible has become possible. And there may not be very many people like that, but there are some. And it's a kind of existence proof for this aspect of human possibility. So, I mean, I hope that's a kind of answer to your question. On the one hand, I want to say, look, I'm not sure how big the controversy is. On the one hand, if we can agree on perhaps different senses of the word mystic, but in the ordinary sense with which she is often described, I think it puts people in mind of somebody who's not in the business of disciplined, systematic thinking and the giving of arguments and proofs by demonstration. And yet, attention to her essays will show that that's exactly the business that she's in. Even about religious things. I mean, in Forms of the Implicit Love of God, she makes the same kind of claim. So it's not that she thinks, oh, well, here philosophy cuts out and religion starts. And that's another strength of the Pythagorean doctrine essay. There she's trying to say, yeah, here's one way of understanding it. And these will be the ways of increasing someone's conviction in this way of seeing things. And here's an alternative way of doing it. And then the modes of conviction that are available there will be different again. So anyways, I don't know if that covers it. I don't want to stir more controversy because I think they often produce more heat than light. And Eric and I had a bit of a back and forth in print around the inattention after his very generous review of our book. And I feel like we arrived at the kind of place where there might still be some differences between us, but I'm not sure how much distance there was.
In my eyes, at least, the significance of this disagreement over the classification of Simone Weil as a mystic also has to do with what style of writing it is that we're looking for when we're looking for the texts that are meant to be authoritative with respect to her position. So when I weigh in on these debates over whether Weil was or was not a mystic, what I have in mind, maybe from a more polemical perspective, is trying to combat this much more familiar interpretation of Weil that will prioritize the notebooks, and especially those abstracts from them collected in Gravity and Grace. And naturally, doing so leads to quite a heavily distorted picture of her philosophy. We end up thinking that concepts like decreation and metaxu are the fulcrum around which her entire system, if she has a system, revolves. But in fact, when we look at the things which she had written for the purpose of publication, to my knowledge, decreation doesn't come up in her essays. It may come up in some letters. I'm not entirely sure. But it would be interesting to hear what you make of. Maybe not whether this bears on whether or not she's a mystic, but what this popular way of approaching Weil, that is, with the expectation that she will share certain stylistic similarities with mystics, that she'll be an aphoristic thinker, what this does to her philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that Gravity and Grace is a bit of an abomination of a Weilian work. It's not really a book by Weil at all. And Ronald Collins, for example, has written at length about this and demonstrated the way in which Thiebaum, who edited the book together, has introduced elements that we're not clear what the sources are, but certainly he has put things out of order. He's moved sentences around. And more importantly, he has clipped paragraphs from what are long trains of thought. When you go to the notebooks, they are not aphorisms. Very often she'll write for several pages at a time on just one theme. So in that sense, by the time she's done, it's sort of like 1,200 words, which is more like a little mini essay, and she's pursuing a particular line of thought. So then to extract a piece of it without any context, it's just irresponsible. And it has given a very distorted picture to Weil's thinking. And an essay like God's Love and Affliction is extremely hard-hitting and powerful, but it's not aphoristic at all. I mean, it's quite a long essay, and she grinds out these points. And of course, if there was ever a place to have decreation, it would have been there. And when you go back to the notebooks and you look at places where she's first trying out the ideas that appear in the essay on affliction, they may mention decreation, although decreation actually doesn't get mentioned that many times in the notebooks even. But they don't appear, it doesn't appear in God's Love and Affliction. There she talks about self-negation. Moreover, the idea of decreation seems to feed into this popular narrative of her as some kind of ascetic who was bent on her own self-destruction, even though she's abundantly clear in the text, nobody can desire affliction. It is against nature to do so. She says this more than once. And in her own writing, both in the notebooks and in the essays, she talks about being reborn. So the process of decreation is not the result, as Vito claims, that we somehow return to God, as it were, return to space dust or something like that. But rather, she says, in the process of negating ourselves, of negating our person, of negating the personal, of grounding ourselves in the impersonal, in the true, and in the good, we will be reborn, as she puts it, of spirit and water. Now, of course, that language, or actually what she says is, we will be begot of spirit and water. And that sounds very Christian and religious. But in fact, as she spells out in the notebooks, it's rather mundane in some sense. Water is that amorphous material, which is matter, and which in Plato's Timaeus, which is dialogue she leans on heavily, is called the receptacle or the matrix, the stuff which is formless. And water indeed is the best image of what is formless. And spirit here is that which lends to water its form, its direction. So it's the unlimited combined with the limit that produces a person, and a person who has been through the process of being begot from water and spirit, has taken into themselves the divine spirit, something like the spirit of the universe, the truth of the universe, and this has become the guiding principle for their matter, which then follows the laws, we might say, of the order of the universe, or the laws of the divine order of the universe, however you want to put it. So, so it's true that the fact that her first book came out from an ardent right-wing Catholic had a significant impact on how she was initially received. The next book, Waiting on God, was a sort of a funny mixture. There, at least, the writings are really her own, but it was a sort of funny mixture of letters and essays. And I think that she writes her letters quite differently from the way she writes her essays, because she was trained to write differently. So that presentation put people on a certain track, which then drew them through Gravity and Grace to the kind of rock star concepts like decreation, like the void, like gravity and grace themselves as notions. And they, frankly, engage in a rather superficial excitement about these concepts. They are given these short zodiac-like, or maybe not zodiac, astrological sort of remarks about them, and then they run away with them. And I guess I write against it so much because I think it is an impediment to seeing what a brilliant thinker she is and finding those things in her thought which are genuinely novel or powerful, or, as she says, where she has collected thoughts for our age, which other ages before us have collected, and which future ages will have to collect for themselves as well. So I hope that's addressed the question in the way that you framed it. I mean, I could go on. I think metaxu is not one of the worst offenders. I think people, though, have misunderstood metaxu in a way because it sounds like a noun. And so they think, oh, there must be these things, the metaxu. Whereas, again, what the Pythagorean essay shows so clearly is that the metaxu are the means by which mediation occurs. That is to say, the means by which things which are dissimilar are put into relation with each other. And that's especially important for us because we're interested in the ways in which material beings like ourselves are put in touch with immaterial things like, well, geometric forms, structure, truth, the good, all of those sorts of things which we as philosophers are perennially interested in.
If I can just add something very briefly to that, which might be of particular interest to the listeners to this podcast, you mentioned the concept of the void. And it was pointed out to me quite recently that this procedure that you mentioned of someone kind of getting a rockstar concept and running away with it is exactly what Jacques Lacan did with Weil's concept of the void. It was explained to me that a lot of his meditations on this come from his reading of Gravity and Grace. But that's just that's just, you know, by means of a side note. Will, I imagine, might have something interesting to say here, because you mentioned that for Weil, there's this concern with almost normality and abnormality, or with what permits us or persuades us otherwise when it comes to doing what is natural to us. So she does seem to be dealing with a pretty normatively laden concept of the natural, which I imagine must put her in some hot water when it comes to when we have a Foucauldian in the conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the burden of Platonism on Christian philosophy, or really not Plato, but really the pseudo-Dionysian tradition where natural theology begins to find its root, and the place, frankly, where human propriety and the affirmation of that propriety is made most clear, is in I think the fascinating and necessary essay. I'm trying to find it. Is the human person sacred? I can't find it. It's one of the longest essays in the book. But I think the account of affliction here is, because what I had first read was Gravity and Grace. I'd purchased it at Barnes and Noble, and I'd put a photo of it on my Instagram. That thing on Instagram where the picture goes away after a while, the story. And Kenny immediately texts me. He's like, no, don't get that one. he's like, you have the wrong Weil. I was like, oh my God. But yeah, I had found this very strange kind of reactionary almost depiction, and it's harder to make that assessment of Weil in an essay like Is the Human Person Sacred, where really I would say the metaphysical or operational presuppositions of a concept like decreation or self-negation is laid out in the essay. Because really, in her account of both Diderot, who I think is one of the most important thinkers of like who the natural human being is, but she also, I think, importantly cites Rousseau. So this is this idea that the question of the natural human being is something that comes just out of this Platonist tradition is not true. I mean, it's present in the very foundation of Marx's theory of labor. It's present in the very foundation of social democracy's understanding of inequality, both natural and social inequality, right? We pass over Rousseau's conception of natural inequality to get to this more interesting concept in the second discourse, or in the discourse on inequality. So I do think that that obviously there are issues to take up at the level of a philosophy of disability, but at the same time, the way out, I think, for us through Weil is her criticism of the concept of right, and the concept of the possibility of a human right, which I think is far more compelling even than the ones we get from thinkers of the same period, like, say, Hannah Arendt. And for that reason, like, yes, obviously there are some issues, but the way in which she talks about possession of right and its relation to democracy, and the munus in democracy as well, is, I think helpful. Like, am I going to roll my eyes a little bit at truth, beauty, and justice? Of course. Like, I'm not a Platonist. I'm not like that's it's just something that I've had an aversion to. Perhaps I'll change one day. But I think that this essay kind of recontextualized a lot of what I got from Gravity and Grace, which I was oftentimes disappointed by, because I was going into it thinking I was going to find something like a Marguerite Porete, right? A kind of kinesis or a kenotic movement to self-negation, which you don't get. Instead, you get this kind of very scattershot depiction of a kind of religious fetishization of capacity and its accidental non-presence, which is very close to Aquinas's account of how things participate in the divine human being. So those are my thoughts on the relationship between Weil and the norm. Of course, she's a normative thinker. She's in the tradition of, I think, of Plato, but not normative in the 19th century sense of the term. We would have to apply the term in a kind of anachronistic, retroactive way that I don't think would be helpful. At least that's what I'm getting, again, from this one essay.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that. It would take a lot of unpacking to understand what might or might not be philosophically difficult in her ideas for some of your concerns. Certainly, she's not normative about many aspects of human nature, except for the fact that, for example, we're embodied and that we suffer through the flesh and that we contact the world through the flesh. She also, and she feels that she's learned this very much, or rather, she has a much better understanding of it through Marx. We are also social creatures, and therefore there are certain kinds of social dynamics which bear on us in ways that, for example, are essential to affliction. One of the things that often goes unremarked is the extent to which the sense of social diminution, of degradation, that's a literal translation of the French word, but it means sort of like the drop in social standing, the drop in social recognition. These things are essential. So on the one hand, she wants to say these aspects of the human being, and notice, for example, she doesn't talk so much about persons. She says we have duties toward the human being, emphasizing the non-political basis of those duties. But at any rate, she's concerned with these things, and of course with our capacity for thought and experience. So in that sense, I think she does think there are certain essential faculties that allow us to look upon human beings as creatures who suffer and creatures who can do better or worse. On the other hand, she accepts a substantial level of change in what humans might need. So it's very striking that at the start of the need for roots, in where she enumerates the needs of the soul, she says, these are liable to empirical study and revision. These are not the needs of soul now and forever. And the criterion is, what are those things, the privation of which will bring one to a state of death or near death? If anything that satisfies that is a need, that may occur through bodily factors, or it may occur through what we might call factors of the soul, which here is sort of ambiguous between the mind and the social. And so therefore, what is a normal need, if I can put it that way, will be indexed, it will be parochial, in the sense it's what's a need around here, at this moment in history, at this moment in our biological evolution, but I think also our technological evolution. It may well become the case that people will have needs for interconnection with others through, I'm not going to say social media because that conversation drives me nuts, but through information technology. We can easily imagine that by the end of this century, that people will have genuine needs, which, if not met, will bring them into a condition that is either death or very like death. And if that were the case, then by these lights, that would become a need. And therefore, that would become, if you like, salient to natural justice. Natural justice is seeing to it that people's needs are met so that they can pursue their actual, if you like, their purpose. But the point I'm just trying to make is that these needs can change, and their specific, the forms that they will take will be parochial. And in that sense, she's both conservative, but open-minded about human nature. And that's a nice juxtaposition. It's quite powerful, I think.
I mean, I think we're just about running out of time for this conversation. So I'm not sure if Will would like to ask any more questions. Or, all right, then just in closing, David, is there anything that you would like to plug for any of our listeners? Anything that you have going on or that you would like people to know about?
Well, that's not the right question to ask me because I'm loath to sort of pimp my own work.
Well, in that case, then, something I can warmly recommend is not only this book, but also, as I was preparing an article, I came across another essay of yours on Simone Weil and Wittgenstein, and reading through it, I found it, very edifying, especially when so much of the work on Simone Weil comes by means of Wittgensteinians like Rush Rees and Peter Winch.
So I did write a piece for a collection on Weil and Wittgenstein, and you're absolutely right that in that Wittgensteinian tradition, particularly the one associated with the so-called Swansea school, there has often been a thought that there's some kind of deep affinity between Weil and Wittgenstein. Now, sometimes I think this has gone through the rather dubious grounds that both of them appear to be deracinated Jews. And that may well be true, but I actually don't think it's much of a point of contact between them. They really are very different people with very different backgrounds. She grew up in a comfortable setting. He grew up in a spectacularly wealthy setting. And his interest in the work of ordinary laborers was pretty close to nil, despite having worked as a gardener himself. Whereas, of course, she was concerned with those who labor to a fault, one might say. I think it's clear, one wants to be clear, though, about what they saw in her. And certainly people like Rees and Winch and, for example, somebody like Ray Gaeta, what they immediately latched onto was her moral seriousness, a seriousness that they felt, I think, was at some level either incompatible with or at least missing from a great deal of moral philosophy in the 20th century, which had become arid and divorced from the real phenomena of morality. So in the focus of making metaethics the center of moral philosophy, we are obliged to conceive human beings as moral subjects insofar as they make moral judgments. And that, as it were, the characteristic activity of a moral subject on this sort of view is that they make judgments. And the Wittgensteinians, pointing to Wittgenstein's talking about the use of language, or as Cora Diamond might put it, the way in which our life is partially constituted by our use of language, not facilitated by our use of language, but partially constituted by our use of language. Wittgenstein had the effect of returning language and thought much closer to life as it is lived, and the actual practices, the social practices, the linguistic institutions that make sense of the actual histories of our concepts, as well as the actual histories of our use of language, and the kinds of foundations that there were. So that kind of return to praxis, if I can give it a fancy name, was something that they wanted to do with moral philosophy. And the moral seriousness, the attention to moral phenomenology, the attention to the way people actually suffer, to the way that good and evil and the temptations of good and evil actually enter into people's lives, that was something that they saw Weil calling attention to, not only calling attention to, but illustrating time and again from different angles. And so I think there was a strong attraction there. This led to people saying, aha, what she has in common with Wittgenstein is that she's morally serious. Because Wittgenstein also, by reputation at least, and I think it's fair to say by the conduct of his life in many respects, was also very morally serious. And his own notebooks attest to his struggle with being moral, with being decent, with being good. As I argue in that piece, I think there is a superficial similarity between the two of them. They do arrive at a similar place, which is to say that no amount of human ratiocination, no amount of human technology, no amount of doctrine will allow you to evade the basic challenge that we face as moral subjects. To that extent, they agree, but then they go off in completely different directions. Wittgenstein retreats into the self and says, well, whatever's to be found is going to be found from the purification of the self until there is only the self left, as it were, the kind of the pure self is left. And again, that can look similar to Weil, except that Weil goes the other direction. She says, no, we need to return to the world. It will only be by direct contact with reality, by a deepened contact with reality, the kind of contact that's brought about by work and by our other ways of relating ourselves to the world, that we will be able to become good. So in that sense, I think they kind of pull in directions that if they're not polar opposites, they're at least in no way two routes up the same mountain.
On that final note, then, that's as excellent a recommendation as any for people to check out that essay as well. We'll try and put a link to it in the show notes below for anyone who's interested. But I guess just in closing that, if I can say thank you, David, so much for joining us. And Will, thank you for generously letting us use your platform for this conversation.
No, we've been wanting to talk about Weil for a long time, so it was very exciting to have this opportunity to have you folks on. Obviously, we will have sort of the research portal in the notes if this is something that you're interested in. Just one more time, Simone Weil, The Basic Writings. You can find it with Routledge Press. Obviously, I think it is an essential text, and it also frees you from having to cherry pick singular publications that may or may not have been organized by pretty far right Christian thinkers. I've had friends who have gone as far as saying, oh, I don't read Simone Weil because she's a reactionary, which is quite an absurd thing to say in retrospect. But
one advantage of the collection compared to some other anthologies, and one of the reasons for doing it, was to bring a uniform approach to translation, and in that sense, a uniform voice. So I think what you'll find in this collection is far more consistency. You might disagree that this is Weil's voice, perhaps, but nonetheless, I think what you'll find is a consistent voice. Some of the anthologies suffer because you get people who are, on the one hand, possibly proto-fascists, and on the other hand, people who are very who see her as a kind of noble soul and a kind of prophet or a saint.
So for this reason, if you want a cogent approach, again, as Kenny said, and I agree, you can do much worse than it's about 45 pages, the introduction. It's a fantastic engagement with both the context of her work and its sort of internal consistency. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and
thank you very much for having me. It's very nice to be able to talk about Weil, and I appreciate your questions very much.